Good evening and welcome to a very special interview show of The Prode. The economic crisis in Sri Lanka is getting deeper and there is not much of a positive news coming out of the island nation as far as the economic crisis is concerned. Joining us today from Colombo to explain us the ongoing crisis is Ms. Rehana Thowfeek. Rehana is a renowned Sri Lankan economist currently serving in the prestigious Advocata Institute of Sri Lanka. Thank you so much, Rehana, for your time and a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Ritwij.
I would like to begin the discussion by asking that, first of all, what is the current economic situation in Sri Lanka and what are the recent developments as far as the economic crisis is concerned to start with?
Sure, yeah. So the situation is still pretty bad. There are long queues for fuel. There are shortages in cooking gas. There are medicine shortages. There are shortages in certain food items. So people are spending hours and up to sometimes even 24 hours to pump fuel sometimes in queues. We have been having daily power cuts now for quite a long time. Just this week, it's a little less because the ordinary level school children, they are sitting their exams, so they've decided not to cut power as much as they used to. So this week, and I think probably for the next week, we will not have the usual power cuts. But yes, the situation is not that great.
Yeah. Okay. So basically now coming to the background of the whole crisis, could you please take us through the primary factors that triggered the economic crisis in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at so there are two ways you can look at Sri Lanka's economic crisis. There's a long-term there are two structural problems, is that Sri Lanka has for a very long time, for several decades, run what we call a twin deficit. So there's been a budget deficit. Government has been spending more than its revenue, and as a country, we've also been consuming more than we export. So there's been a long time current account deficit as well. So that is the long-term structural problems we've had, and over the course of the several decades and several governments, there have been attempts to try to address it, but obviously holistically there's been no consistent way to address either of these problems. Government expenditure has grown consistently over time, and Sri Lanka has Sri Lanka liberalized in the 80s, but since the 90s, Sri Lanka's openness to trade has been dropping. So Sri Lanka has become increasingly protectionist, and as a result, we've kind of really failed to capitalize on capitalize to grow our export baskets. So we still rely very heavily on apparel and tea. There has been, since the end of the war, there has been an organic growth in tourism. Because Sri Lanka has the natural beauty and the diversity, and it attracts a lot of tourists who are interested in exploring the country. But there has not really been any comprehensive effort to make sure that the benefits the country gets from tourism are spread wide enough around the country so that all sorts of communities can benefit from it. So there have been little pockets that have been growing because of the increased tourism. And then when you then we can go back to talking about what has happened over the course of the last 2 years that led us to this situation. So if there was one event that economists talk about that really sort of change the trajectory of Sri Lanka, it's the tax cuts that were done in December 2019. So about a couple of weeks after the current president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, won the elections, he announced a spate of tax cuts. So a lot of corporate taxes were cut. There were lots of tax exemptions given. Income taxes were reduced, and a new system was introduced, and this actually cost the Sri Lankan government about 600 billion rupees in revenues. So because Sri Lanka was, we already had this long-term budget deficit problem. Once these taxes were cut, Sri Lanka was actually downgraded in the international markets. So which meant that Sri Lanka couldn't continue to borrow from the international finance markets like it used to. And it became increasingly difficult for Sri Lanka to roll over its debt. And the government, it adopted this a whole anti-IMF, anti-debt restructuring stance, and it kept insisting that we'll somehow pay the debt. We are not going to default. We don't need the IMF. So until about March 2020, that was the stance of the government, and it delayed. We had to go for an IMF program, but the government kept delaying it, and now we are in a serious crisis.
Yeah. But many experts argue that COVID-19 was one of the most important factors that led to the economic situation, because tourism sector has a significant amount of contribution in the Sri Lankan GDP. So what is your observation?
Yeah, if you look at the numbers, so in, I spoke about the current account deficit and the balance of payments. So Sri Lanka, if you look at export performance in 2021, it actually picked up quite well, and it recovered quite well. And yes, tourism was heavily impacted, and we do earn about $4 to $5 billion of foreign exchange from tourism. But in my opinion, it's not COVID that caused us to have the crisis, because the real decision that changed the fate of Sri Lanka was the tax cuts that happened, because that is what ended up locking Sri Lanka out of the finance markets, which meant that we couldn't do what we usually do, which is rolling over our debt. And then obviously COVID, completely aggravated the situation. But just yesterday it was revealed that so there's this whole thing of debt sustainability, which basically means can a country serve its debt in a sustainable manner without having to resort to any extraordinary measures. So before the tax cuts of November, Sri Lanka's debt was deemed sustainable, right? So we could pay our debts without much of an issue. So by March 2020, which was before COVID, came to Sri Lanka, by then we had been declared that our debt was not sustainable, right? So that was before COVID, and it's obvious that it's the tax cuts which drove Sri Lanka through this crisis and not COVID. So I don't agree with that, that assertion that it's COVID that caused Sri Lanka to end up in this situation.
Yeah, well, you talked about like tax cuts. So the Sri Lankan government taken some populist measures like tax cuts and made larger tax cut that affected the fiscal policy. So could you please put some more light on this topic?
Sure. So the tax cuts, I think, were granted. It was part of the president's manifesto, elections manifesto. So it was obviously, granted as per his election promises, and to because they were going to go into a parliamentary elections in the following year in 2020. So it was a matter of, trying to consolidate the support for their party, which they ended up, they ended up winning. They actually got 2/3 majority in parliament at the end of it. They say that they wanted to encourage smaller businesses, to invest and to grow. But if you look at how if you look at the tax breakdowns in Sri Lanka, the ones who ended up benefiting are the big corporations, are the big businesses. So I personally don't think that there was, much of an impact on the smaller businesses. And then obviously once COVID came And it became kind of obvious that COVID was not going to go away. Experts were, already talking at that time, it's going to take at least 2 years for the pandemic to come to an end. Our government decided that, no, it's okay, we are going to keep going down this road. So even in 2021, there were no reversals to the tax cuts that were taken. So they passed another budget with, similar tax considerations. And finally, in November 2022, there was an attempt. I think by that time, the crisis had totally, was coming to a peak. By that time, they started proposing different measures of trying to increase the tax base. They introduced retrospective taxes and super gain taxes, taxes like that. But now it has come to a situation where the government does not have any money, and taxes don't flow in every day. There's you pay your taxes every quarter, so the government doesn't have any money to even pay salaries or to pay social security payments. It's not in a position to borrow. So yeah.
Okay, so Sri Lankan usable forex reserve is now down at under $50 million. So what are your thoughts on the same, and what urgent steps are needed in order to fix the particular issue, and how we can overcome the crisis of the tax cuts, like the crisis that happened because of the tax cuts? Like, what can government do now? Do they have to increase the taxes once again? Like, how it can be dealt?
Yeah, actually, I think the foreign reserves are down, I think, under $1 million now. I think that's what the governor of the central bank recently said. In Sinhala, he basically said, there's no, we can't even collect, actually the prime minister, sorry, he said we don't even have $1 million. So it's way below 50 million. So the only route, so we have, the country has been engaging with the IMF. We have, on April 12th, we entered into a preemptive default. So we told our lenders that we are not in a position to pay, and we intend to restructure our debt. We are now, we've just hired the financial and legal advisors to begin that whole debt restructuring discussion. So that is underway. But, the IMF has told us, and even the World Bank recently, that any sort of financial assistance would only come once Sri Lanka presents a very comprehensive and, robust macroeconomic plan. So I think it might take about nine months at least to get, financial support from the IMF. In the meantime, we have to go for what is called bridge financing, which is basically financial assistance from other parties like friendly governments, friendly nations. So we've got a lot of help from India. They've given us I think a $1 billion credit line, and then another 500 million to buy fuel. And we've been getting aid from the World Bank has sort of rechanneled some of the funding they already had, and they've given that money to us to pay cash subsidies for the poor and the vulnerable. So the real what Sri Lanka has to do, right, try to take much financing as it possibly can. According to what I think Sri Lanka needs about $5 to $6 billion in bridge financing at least, just to just to tide ourselves over. And we need to expedite the debt restructuring process. And then obviously when it comes to the fiscal side, the government has to take measures to increase tax revenue. And the Prime Minister is currently working on presenting a new interim budget, and he has indicated that there will be tax revisions. So I think what we'll see is sort of there might be a process where we go back to the tax structure that was in place before, the 2019 tax cuts. So definitely taxes need to go up, and there also has to be steps taken to cut down on government expenditure where possible. For example, like capital expenditure, like building roads or buildings, that needs to be cut down. And then you need to look at what are the ways, even with recurrent expenditures, what are the ways that the government can cut down, because inflation in Sri Lanka is at like 35%, and food inflation is close to 50%. Fuel prices have doubled in the last 5 months since the start of the year. So, the cost of living is through the roof, and about 60% of Sri Lanka's workforce are informal sector workers, so they're not really high earners. So they are going to struggle a lot, and Sri Lanka and the government has to have some kind of social safety net, which will also require spending. So there has to be the government really has to look at how can you reprioritize government expenditure to make sure that you're meeting, you safeguard these people who are poor, and also newly poor, because the cost of living is rising so rapidly.
Yeah. So many experts from India also claim that, one of the contributing factors to the economic situation in Sri Lanka was Chinese debt trap. So how do you see this, and what, according to you, is the actual truth?
I think this Chinese debt trap narrative is something that you hear a lot in the Indian media in particular. Personally, I don't agree with that narrative. If you look at Sri Lanka's bilateral debt, the bilateral lenders, China China has about 14% of owns about 14% of Sri Lanka's debt, and then there's some component which Sri Lanka has borrowed from, for example, commercial borrowings from places like the Exim Bank of China, but it's still roughly about 14%. And if you look at the other bilateral lenders, Japan is Sri Lanka's largest bilateral lender. So the issue with Chinese debt is not really it's actually, and if you look at Sri Lanka's all the lenders by category, the largest largest owner of Sri Lankan debt are the international sovereign bonds. So Sri Lanka has borrowed heavily from international finance markets. And the problem with ISB's international sovereign bonds is that, for a government which likes to spend discretionally, it's very nice because you can issue an ISB and then, you get a lump sum of $1 billion, and, nobody questions you or checks up on the government asking, how did you spend this money? Which is what happens with, project-based lending or, concessionary lending, which we get from, say, the World Bank or the ADB. But the problem is with the ISB is also that when it becomes mature, suddenly you have to pay $1 billion, upfront. So when you've borrowed, ISBs so often, it comes to a point where suddenly you have to pay $2-3 billion at once. So the issue with Sri Lanka is that it hasn't. The issue is really not with borrowing, whether you borrow from China, whether you borrow from the international finance markets. The issue with Sri Lanka, how the Sri Lanka government has spent its money, is what did you really spend this money on, and did you spend this money on something that's earning a revenue? Did you build? What kind of infrastructure did you build? So I think the issue with Chinese debt is kind of different because it's not really about the value of the amount we have borrowed, but it's about different issue, with regard to what did Sri Lanka spend that money on. For example, you must have heard of several what we call white elephant projects that has been done with Chinese funding, such as the Maktala Airport, the Hambantota Port. There is, you may have seen pictures of the Lotus Tower in Colombo, which we built with Chinese funding, which, at present serves absolutely no purpose and has generated zero revenue. Now, I'm not blaming the Chinese government for this. I think the blame is totally on the Sri Lankan government. But yeah, I don't think we are in a Chinese debt trap. We are in, the issue with our borrowings is that we haven't borrowed and invested that money into revenue generating activities or in a sustainable manner. So now we are in a situation where there's these massive payments that have to be made, and we are just simply not able to do that.
Yeah. So what is the way forward for Sri Lanka, and how much time will take for Sri Lankan economy to overcome the crisis, and when can we expect the economic normalcy in your country?
Depends on how quickly Sri Lanka is able to come to an agreement with its lenders on how we will restructure our debt. What kind of haircut will the bondholders take? So all of that will take some time, I think. So, and IMF has been very clear. They've said, board approval is needed for financial support. So it will, I think, from my understanding, it may take about 9 to 10 months. But in the interim, Sri Lanka has to obviously start securing a lot more, bridge financing and start, attracting foreign currency into the country, because that's the only way that we can sort of tide our way until we are once again back on our feet. Personally, I think Sri Lanka is not going to return to a state of normalcy for, I would say, 2 years. But maybe in about a year's time, things might start looking up again. But all of it depends on, how well and how fast we carry out the debt restructuring program, and how well we finally take the measures that are needed to address our, two structural problems, which is that budget deficit and the current account deficit problem.
Yeah, really hope the situation gets better in Sri Lanka soon. On this note, I want to end this interview. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that you have taken out the time to do this.
Thank you, Ritwij.
Thank you so much.